1 oz of gold. For every single resident in this nation, 1 ounce. For every single person living within its borders. Not a promise, not a campaign slogan, a number that already exists, right now, inside a vault, that almost nobody's talking about. While the world watches inflation headlines and argues over interest rates, one nation has quietly built something most governments could never dream of. Enough gold to hand every single resident more than an ounce and still have reserves left over. This isn't a wealthy superpower. It isn't even one of the largest economies on Earth. So which nation is it? And more importantly, what does it know that your government doesn't want you thinking about? By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why this matters. Not just for that nation, but for every single person watching this, wherever you are. And to those of you who've been with us a while, you already know how this works around here. But if you're new, here's a small favor I'd like to ask you. You know how, back in the day, neighbors used to look out for one another, share what they knew, pass along the kind of advice that actually mattered? That's really all this channel is. So if you found something useful here today, do an old-fashioned thing for me. Press that subscribe button and tap the bell beside it so you don't miss the next one. It costs you nothing and it means a great deal to us. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from today? Drop your city and country in the comments below. I read every single one. Now, let's get into it. In the early months of 2026, a quiet report passed through financial circles. It did not make front page news. It did not trend on social media. But for those who study money and power, it was one of the most important findings of the year. The report came from an analysis of data collected by the World Gold Council. Researchers had examined how much gold every central bank in the world was holding. Then they did something simple, yet powerful. They divided that gold by the number of people living in each country. The results surprised almost everyone. Most people assume that the richest, most powerful nations would lead this list. They imagine the largest economies sitting at the top, holding the most gold per person. But that is not what the data showed. A mid-sized European nation, one rarely mentioned in global financial headlines, had quietly secured a position among the strongest in the world. That nation was Portugal. Researchers found that Portugal held close to 383 tons of gold in its central bank. When they divided this number across every single resident, the result came out to nearly 37 grams of gold per person. That is more than 1 full troy ounce for every man, woman, and child living in the country. To understand why this matters, it helps to think about what gold represents. Gold is not just a shiny metal locked away in a vault. For centuries, nations have treated it as the ultimate form of financial protection. Paper currency can lose value. Bonds can default. Bank accounts can be frozen. But gold holds its worth across generations, across wars, and across financial crises that have destroyed other forms of wealth. This is why central banks do not buy gold for excitement or fashion. They buy it because they expect difficult times ahead. They buy it because they want a form of wealth that cannot simply disappear with the click of a button on a screen somewhere far away. Portugal's situation became even more remarkable when analysts looked deeper into the numbers. Gold made up nearly 78% of the country's total reserves. This is an extremely high number compared to most nations. It told experts something important. Portugal was not casually holding on to old, leftover gold from history. It was actively choosing to keep its wealth anchored in the one asset that foreign governments cannot freeze, devalue, or take away with a political decision. In raw numbers, Portugal even outranked far larger nations. It held more gold than Spain, more than the United Kingdom, more than Sweden, more than Brazil, and more than Greece. These are countries with much larger populations and much larger economies. Yet a smaller nation, often overlooked, had built a stronger financial shield for each of its own citizens. Switzerland, of course, still led the world on this measure, with well over 100 grams of gold for every resident. But Switzerland is famous for this kind of careful financial planning. Portugal's high ranking came as a genuine surprise to many who follow these reports closely. Why does this matter to people far away from Portugal? People who may never even visit the country? Because this story is not really about one small European nation. It is about a much bigger shift happening quietly across the entire world. Governments everywhere are beginning to ask the same question. If a crisis came tomorrow, if currencies weakened, if access to foreign assets was suddenly cut off, what would actually protect their people? More and more, the answer being chosen by central banks is the same. It is gold. This single report, buried in technical data and spreadsheets, revealed something deeper. It showed which nations were quietly preparing for an uncertain future and which were not. It showed that size and wealth on paper do not always mean real financial strength. Sometimes the smaller, quieter nations are the ones making the smartest moves. And, as the next part of this story will reveal, Portugal's case opens the door to a much larger question. Across the world, a handful of nations have been making the very same calculation, often without much public attention. Some of their stories are even more surprising than this one. To truly understand why Portugal's position mattered, analysts had to look at the opposite end of the scale. They needed to study the giants, the countries everyone assumes are the strongest, the safest, the wealthiest. What they found exposed a pattern that very few people had ever stopped to consider. China stood out first. By the end of 2025, China's central bank held more than 2,279 tons of gold. On paper, that sounds enormous. It is one of the largest gold reserves on the entire planet. But China also has a population of over 1.42 billion people. When researchers divided the gold across every single citizen, the number dropped sharply. Each person's theoretical share came to only about 1.6 grams of gold. That is a tiny fraction of a single troy ounce. This created a strange and uncomfortable truth. A nation could be a giant in total gold holdings and still be among the weakest in the world when measured person by person. Size alone told a misleading story. India showed a similar pattern. Its central bank had been actively buying gold for years, pushing its reserves up by nearly 40% over 5 years. That kind of growth sounds impressive. Yet, with a population also above 1.4 billion people, the per capita results still came out to less than 1 gram of gold per person. The effort was real. The protection per individual remained thin. Then analysts turned to Switzerland, and the picture flipped completely. Switzerland's central bank held just over 1,000 tons of gold. That number is far smaller than China's, but Switzerland's population is only around 8.8 million people. When the math was done, each Swiss resident had a theoretical claim to more than 118 grams of gold. That is roughly 3.5 troy ounces per person, the highest ratio found anywhere on Earth. This comparison revealed something analysts considered one of the most important lessons in modern economics. A country does not need to be the largest economy or hold the most gold in total to give its people the strongest financial shield. What matters far more is the relationship between reserves and population. A small, disciplined nation can quietly outperform a giant. Germany told a slightly different story, but one that pointed in the same direction. With just over 83 million people and gold reserves above 3,300 tons, Germany reached a per capita figure above 40 grams. Analysts noted that this reflected something cultural as much as financial. Germany has held a deep, long-standing trust in gold for generations, dating back to painful memories of currency collapse in its own history. That memory shaped policy decades later. This is where the story moved from numbers to something more human. Nations do not choose to hold gold by accident. Every decision reflects a memory, a fear, or a lesson learned the hard way. Germany remembered what happened when its currency became worthless overnight. Switzerland built its identity around financial independence and neutrality. Portugal, smaller and quieter, had simply chosen to keep a very high share of its reserves locked safely in gold, rather than depending heavily on foreign currencies that other governments could control. A clear divide began to appear between two types of nations. On one side were countries with enormous populations and large total gold reserves, yet thin protection for each individual citizen. On the other side were smaller, often overlooked nations, where each person's theoretical share of gold was significantly higher. This divide carried a deeper warning. Total wealth held by a government means very little if it is spread across too many people. What truly mattered, analysts argued, was resilience per person. A nation's real financial strength could no longer be judged simply by headlines about total reserves. It needed to be judged by a much sharper question. If everything were divided equally tomorrow, how much real protection would each citizen actually have? This question became even more urgent once analysts considered why this shift was happening in the first place. Central banks were not simply buying gold out of habit or tradition anymore. Something had changed in the global financial system itself, something that pushed nation after nation toward the very same decision at almost the very same time. And that change traces back to a single defining moment, a moment that altered how every government on Earth viewed the safety of its own money. Every major shift in history has a starting point, a single event that forces governments to rethink everything they once believed was safe. For the modern gold story, that moment arrived in February 2022. When Russia invaded Ukraine, Western governments responded with a financial move that had rarely been used on this scale before. They froze approximately $300 billion belonging to Russia's central bank. This money had been sitting abroad, in foreign banks, in foreign currencies, fully expected to be safe and accessible whenever needed. It was not safe. In a matter of days, it became completely unreachable. This single decision sent a quiet shockwave through finance ministries and central banks around the world. It was not really about Russia anymore. It was about a much bigger and far more uncomfortable question. If one nation's reserves could be frozen overnight by foreign governments, then whose reserves were truly safe? Reserve managers everywhere reached the same uneasy conclusion at almost the same time. Holding wealth in another country's currency means trusting that country's goodwill. The trust can disappear the moment political relationships change. A friendly ally today could become a restricted partner tomorrow, and once that happens, money that looked perfectly safe on paper can become completely useless in practice. Gold offered something no foreign currency could promise. Physical gold, sitting inside a nation's own vaults, cannot be frozen by a foreign government. It cannot be sanctioned. It cannot be deleted from a digital ledger with a single signature. It simply exists, fully under the control of whoever holds it. This realization changed buying behavior almost immediately. In 2022 alone, central banks purchased over 1,000 tons of gold, the highest annual total in more than 50 years. The following year, they added over 1,000 tons again. This was not random buying driven by short-term excitement. It was a deliberate, calculated shift in how nations chose to protect themselves. By the first quarter of 2026, this pattern still had not slowed down. Central banks bought nearly 250 tons in just 3 months, a number higher than both the previous quarter and the 5-year average. Analysts were clear about what this meant. This was not speculation. It was strategy. Poland became one of the clearest examples of this new mindset in action. Sitting near regions of ongoing geopolitical tension, its central bank increased gold holdings dramatically over a short period, moving from just over 100 tons to several hundred tons within a handful of years. For a country watching instability unfold close to its own borders, gold became less of an investment choice and more of a basic safety requirement. Even the world's most powerful institutions reinforced this shift. The Bank for International Settlements, often described as the central bank for central bankers, classified gold as a top-tier asset. This single classification placed gold on equal footing with the world's strongest currencies. It was an extraordinary acknowledgement from the very heart of the global financial system. The institutions managing the world's money agreed that physical gold deserved the highest level of trust available. This explains why nations like Portugal, Switzerland, and Germany were not behaving randomly when they held such high levels of gold per person. They were following the same defensive logic, now spreading across the entire world. Hold real, physical wealth that cannot be taken away by someone else's political decision. The pattern becomes impossible to ignore once it is laid out clearly. Before 2010, central banks were net sellers of gold. After 2022, they became consistent, aggressive buyers, and that behavior has not reversed since. This raises a final and far more personal question. If the world's most cautious financial institutions are repositioning themselves this seriously, choosing real assets over promises written on paper, what does that mean for individuals who are not central banks, who do not have vaults, and who are simply trying to protect what they have worked for? By now, the pattern is clear. Central banks are not buying gold because it is fashionable. They are buying it because they have studied history, and history has taught them a hard lesson. Paper promises can fail. Currencies can be frozen. Political relationships can change overnight. Gold, sitting quietly in a vault, answers to no one but the nation that holds it. This is the part of the story that moves beyond charts and government reports. It becomes personal. Every individual in every country manages their own version of a reserve. It might be a savings account, a retirement fund, or simply cash set aside for difficult times. Most people never stop to ask the same question that central banks have already answered for themselves. If a crisis arrived tomorrow, how much of that wealth would still be there, fully under their own control, untouched by inflation, untouched by a frozen account, untouched by a currency suddenly losing its value? Central banks have already given their answer. They are shifting away from depending entirely on foreign currencies and paper assets. They are choosing something they can hold, something physical, something that has protected wealth across centuries of wars, collapses, and crises that wiped out entire fortunes built on paper alone. This is not a call for panic. It is a call for awareness. The most cautious, most conservative institutions in the entire global financial system, the very organizations responsible for protecting national wealth, have made their decision clear through their own actions. They did not announce it with dramatic headlines. They simply kept buying year after year, quarter after quarter, long after most people had stopped paying attention. For business owners, entrepreneurs, and anyone building wealth for the future, this pattern carries a direct lesson. Diversification is no longer just a financial buzzword discussed by analysts on television. It has become a basic principle, followed by the very institutions tasked with protecting entire nations. If the safest, most careful financial managers in the world feel the need to hold real, physical assets outside the traditional banking system, that decision deserves serious attention rather than quiet dismissal. Portugal's story began this entire discussion for a reason. A nation often overlooked on the world stage had quietly built one of the strongest per capita gold positions anywhere on Earth. It did not need to be the richest country or the largest economy to achieve this. It simply needed a clear, consistent strategy followed patiently over time. That same lesson applies far beyond government policy. Strength is rarely about size alone. It is about preparation, patience, and making thoughtful decisions before a crisis forces those decisions to be made under pressure. Nations that prepared early are now standing in a stronger position than nations many times their size. The numbers explored throughout this story are not just statistics buried in a financial report. They represent a quiet signal from the most careful institutions on the planet. A signal suggesting that the world is entering a period where real, tangible assets matter more than they have in decades. Whether that signal is something to act on personally is a decision left entirely to each individual watching. But ignoring it completely, while the world's central banks continue buying at record levels, year after year, would mean ignoring one of the clearest economic warnings available today. The choice, as always, belongs to the people willing to pay attention. You said, write a highly SEO-optimized YouTube video description of about 150 words.